Okay, good morning, everyone. Just a quick notice before Miri starts, but when the session ends, for the break, we'll just go down all together to the lawn outside and take a group picture. Okay, if you brought your shirts, put them on, and if you didn't, so never mind. We love you anyway. And group picture because afterwards people start going in and out, and so the end of the session, group pictures downstairs. Okay.
Thank you. So I'm just going to get comfortable here. So yesterday and the day before, we talked a lot about representations. We saw lots and lots of maps. I learned a great deal, definitely. I think today we're turning towards lived spaces, lived cities, how people organize them, people in the pictures, as it were. Not so much the monstrous ones, but just the various groups that made urban spaces. I sent a sort of, I asked that people read, and perhaps some of you have read some of what I suggested, and I think it'll be obvious how and why, just to introduce people who are here from so many different disciplines to the possibilities of thinking about urban spaces in particular. When I give examples, when we will look at a few texts, it will be texts that I happen to have at my fingertips because of what I'm doing now. But it's not, I mean, the variety of sources and resources, visual, material, textual, so many possibilities of using, and it connects also with the orientation that I sent you to read in the article by De Monk about assembling. How to think of the city as an assemblage that is made indeed of this combination of ideas and practices and things. And so, sorry, no, I'm doing this actually. So, I'm not blocking anybody. You're okay? Yeah, okay. So I just thought it would be fun if during this session, you constantly, each and every one of you, and particularly the students who come from such a diverse array of disciplines, it's been so great to learn so much and to but get here for a shared purpose. Just think about what you help with, how this helps you, or if it baffles you, that too will be of interest. We will talk a bit about how urban spaces are thought of now by people whose job it is to think about them. We will go back to some pre-modern writers about how they articulated the meaning of the urban space. We'll then look at the city as diversity and what that means for our practice as historians and others. And in keeping with the interests of this school, we will also reflect on knowledge and passing, yes, the connection cities and not the centers of knowledge production and conservation. Then we will think about the assemblage, and maybe we'll take a little break there also to hear from you what you got out of De Monk's very short, I thought, but helpfully introductory article. And then we will just delve a little bit deeper into urban spaces as they become places, in this sort of passage from the space, the place, the measurable thing, and the human meanings that are created within it. And then at every point, any perspective or question that comes from your various interests. Also along the way, I must say this morning, I added just a few pointers where I named some of you, just some of the students, in terms of how already I see your projects possibly reflecting or intersecting with the trends that I'm delineating here. So how to think about urban space? How do people whose job it is think about it now? So I just sort of collected a few attempts to, and you'll see that people find it difficult actually to say, what is the urban space? What is a city? So I took this from the European Commission's data platform, and you may be surprised, or maybe not, that as yet there is no global agreement on what a city is. Definitions vary widely from country to country, not only in terms of method, but also as regards the idea of urbanity that comes with it. And I should say that in the historical study of cities, there is a similar, Philip will know these discussions, historians say, what is a city? Is it because a certain charter was given to borough, like Cambridge, where I live, 1209, the people, yes, you can organize yourself and you pay me £5 a year. That's one, yes, they clearly are an urban community, or is it that density of population that to a minute, or is it certain types of functions? Is there a market? Is there a port? So clearly still baffling, even the very well-meaning people at the European Commission. Then this is a sort of more professional gathering of not so long ago, of urban designers and urban planners. So they thought indeed through the density, but also numbers. That is dense in a certain type of nucleated village, but you're still not a town. So it's about numbers and densities and housing. And also here it's about shape in the second part of the definition, contiguous grid cells. And that will combine with an idea about grafting that we'll get to in a minute. So this is not something that I want us to discuss in depth, but rather to say that what urban space is was, debated then, is debated now. And of course, different political systems. Bruce, yes.
Wait a minute, what are those definitions used?
This is for this gathering of this happened, they wrote, it's a conference every few years of urban planners. This happened third one, which met in Quito, and this is what they produced, as it were, the organizing, not a call for papers, but the sort of organizing mission that they. So these are again urbanistic professionals, not particularly historically informed, very much about the here and the now. Again, going for a definition that is about shape, it's about minimal population threshold, and it's about density.
This is concerning things for legal matters essentially, or zoning and stuff like that.
Yes, because all these professionals, when they go home, they belong to all those types of organizations that have to take decisions. So that's why it's so important for them. So if historians can continue discussing this for quite a long while, and it will, yes, affect the shape of their work. Here it is a question of reaching definitions that enable policy, etc. Yes, exactly. It's to inform policy and major NGOs, particularly in the global south. And then something more, I just thought I might bring this. It's very unfashionable or uncommon to actually circulate an actual book, but I happened to have it with me and I thought you may enjoy. And so this here book tries to think of the city through the city as a center for the production and conservation of knowledge. And it's sort of resistant to the idea that at long last now, thanks to the digital world that we live in, cities can be super smart and all their traditional problems will be resolved. Issues about transportation, about sustainability. You can all imagine that there is this idea of smart city. Smart city is designed from scratch, sort of like the city that is being designed in the center of the Arabian Peninsula right now by Saudi Arabia, or fixing failing or malfunctioning cities with all their historical heritage. A great belief in the possibility to infuse cities with such levels of information and, of course, technical possibility that would resolve all the problems, or at least make them much, much better places to live in. So this scholar is Shannon Matten, who's an anthropologist, very interesting anthropologist who looks at, she inhabits the space between the study of the urban and the study of digital world and its possibilities. So she sort of critiques this type of idea. And she, on the contrary, and a long tradition of people writing about cities, like she cites Mumford, where the marker is, but that's just one example, that cities were always dense with information. Cities were always smart. They were always smarter than a lot of other parts of polities, because that's where archives were, and central government, and courts, and scholars, as we heard. and map makers. So there was always a density. They were always smart in that sense. And it's that smartness of production and cultivation of knowledge that is what she thinks characterizes the urban, rather than, so she resists this idea of cities will change because they will become smart. She also develops a quite nice discussion of the likening of cities within the smart city tradition. There's a lot of use of trees. And I should say, I was thinking of you because of junctions. These images of junctions between the digital world. What did you say? Yes, no, or? You educated me yesterday when we talked about the junction
Yeah.
in thinking about digital connectivity.
Yeah, I was talking about there is a book of von Neumann who designed the.
So that's like 80 years ago, right?
Yeah, it's the mid-50s.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was building the computer with Turing, and he wrote a book before he passed away. It was called The Computer and the Brain, and it was like bringing together first thoughts about linking the process of neurons to the processes of the computer and other stuff. I don't think he touched cities or urban planning, but it was the same logic of bringing together complex clusters with the same logic.
But the image of the tree and the image of the junction
Yeah,
overlap importantly, don't they? And what she shows is these traditions of thinking about cities as trees that grow in response to various types of economic, political, climatic prompts. And that likening that process to something that's quite natural. You may think it's not natural, but it is in fact a natural process to graft. It's not only natural, it's ancient. That is to say, grafting operates through natural, man-assisted natural processes or human-assisted natural processes. So, sorry, yes?
maybe we can think about as rhizomatic.
Yeah,
It's,
we're going to get to networks in a minute. Yes, exactly. Trees and underground as well, in a way, yeah. And there's a wonderful Richard Powell in his book, people know his book, about trees above and below. It's exactly that rhizomatic system. Amazing book, yes. Richard Powell is one of our great thinkers of our time, I think. If you haven't read him, please do. So the reason I've gone into this, segued into this, is to say, the thinking of how knowledge grows, that cities were always knowledge rich, and that they spread that, develop that knowledge and then spread that knowledge to systems that are maybe tree-like and wasn't. Didn't you talk about tree diagrams?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought that was quite nice to already see some of these. Why is this tree system, it's good for thinking then, but it's also, the claim would be that it actually is the map of what is, the way cities and information grows in your case. And in this case, she's trying to think the city through this imagery in her attempt to reject the idea of now something very new will arrive as cities will become smart. They're always smart and smart in these interesting ways. I quite like your book and it's very, very readable. So, just to remind people who do not inhabit the pre-modern world, as several of us who've presented so far do, just to remind you that across time, when we study our specific period or a specific place, we are always thinking in comparison. We are always thinking about the urban in other, we learn by looking at the possibilities in other cultures and other times. We'll find that there are recurrent phenomena, there are recurrent desires for the city to look and do certain things. And yet at the same time, we are super committed to embedding our city in its environment as people have to struggle with what are very, very, very local challenges and issues. So, which can be, climatic and political. So every city bears the marks clearly of the pathway that has brought it to where it is. but it's also extremely fruitful, I think, too. I'm very happy to circulate the slides later if you want, so if it needs, you don't have to take photographs. So we all benefit from that, and that's true. I think a true template for all our intellectual work in this always reaching out comparison, and of course, for the enforced and very fruitful comparison of embedding our work within certain conceptual and theoretical fields, talking to all of you and asking you, what underpins, what has made you think the way you do, and at the same time, deeply committed to the specificity which gives dignity to people in the past of whom the challenges they had to confront, and not turning them into a sort of generalized state, but actually really recognizing and doing so through our archival work, a lot of which has already been displayed in this conference. And a lot was said yesterday about imagining it, right? Imagine cities, or imagine, and cities are always, the most high, are always a product of the imagination and the fantasies and the utopias that inhabit the minds of actors as diverse as, city planners, preachers in our period had, our period, so I'm looking at you during 15th, 16th century, ideas of how to make the city pure, how to reform it, all sorts of ways. You get rid of prostitutes and beggars and Jews, and you enforce a certain type of high level Catholic morality, and you also encourage the cult of the Virgin Mary. So that's, for example, a Franciscan reforming vision for a 15th or 16th century city, which of course had power behind it, because just like the planners have city council behind them, preachers often had very willing city councils behind them that allowed them to help design the city in areas where the town fathers, as they were, did not have the expertise. The town fathers were very good at thinking about, fiscality and commercial connections and getting rid of the rubbish and so on. They sort of handed over sometimes their thinking about the city, particularly in that later medieval period of the sort of, would you call it, Philip, Philip is our one of the world's experts on what's called the plague. Is that the word to use, to portmanteau, to describe the sort of set of calamities, demographic calamities that beset Europe and other parts in the later Middle Ages?
Sorry, are you talking about specifically that particular disease which is caused by Yersinia pestis?
Yes.
The plague, yes.
Okay. In that answer is embedded a world of controversies that Philip has eliminated. But what I wanted to just mention, that there is a sort of loss of confidence I discern in those post-plague. And of course, it's not just one plague, it's constant revisitations of the plague over the following decades. So this demographic and environmental and human crisis actually sort of robbed a lot of the traditional roots from their sense that they know what's going on. And a lot of cities, particularly Italian cities, they really just handed over whole areas of sort of moral and cultural leadership to professionals who are preachers with particular agendas. And one of those agendas was to clean up the city, literally from the cleaning up of the streets, from the sequestration of undesirables to the enhancements of purity through certain types of cults, the Virgin, as I said, through public ritual, penance, informative. So just to say, this is really an amplification of the second point, that the planning is always in the hands of a whole lot of different types of agents that are actually conflicting in terms of their jurisdictions and in terms of their resources and authority. So, for example, you may have a city council that welcomes all foreigners in because foreigners makes the city flourish. At the same time, in a parish church, or even in the very same marketplace, you might find a preacher that preaches a very different type of vision. So just to say, the city is full of different types of informations and desires and moralities that these different agents propound. And it's always a political struggle as to who wins the hearts and minds of groups and populations. And so that's sort of point two has segued into the third point. That's sort of what an historical approach, the type of questions and then go to approach those who are to take mine. But then if we just delve back and just give two examples of how people in the past wrote about the city, of course, you've become used by now after 2 days with Tony and Sue to be aware of the classical tradition is alive and kicking in throughout this medieval early modern period. So just to give one example would be Isidore of Seville, an archbishop from Iberia living under the Gothic regime, which is one of the many different kingdoms that developed after the breakdown of the Roman administrative system in the 5th century. So there is part of this ongoing attempt to hang on to as much of the capacious classical intellectual tradition, the knowledge base of times past, by preparing books that are summative handbooks and reference books. So we would call reference books useful reference books to people who do not have access to the full array of books and educational institutions that a gentleman in 2nd century would have had within the Roman Empire system. So he summarizes and he says that civitas, right? Civitas is a multitude of people united by a bond of fellowship. It is named from or for its citizens, civis, the citizens. That is the inhabitants of the place, because it decides upon and holds the lives of many people, comprises of many people. Orbs is the town itself. So orbs is space. Okay. In terms of our evolving conversation here. The civitas is the rocks, not the place, not the ground and the feet of these people, but the inhabitants and what they create. So there is a difference here between the space, the rocks upon which the city is implanted, and what we might say the ethos, laws, the culture, the urban culture that is developed. That's one. And you can see that the influence of Cicero continues here when we read this excerpt from Brunetto Latini, who is an extraordinary individual, how we will describe it, a combination of politician, scholar, a very dramatic life as well. And he writes one, again, in a way, one of those distillations, and in this case, in the educated, although he was Florentine, this is written in this literary language that was a version of French at the time, very much influenced by Italian. And he says it's a more developed version of what we heard in the 7th century. From that time, they began, this is in the mists of time, it's on a specific date that he gives there. From that time, they began to build houses and strengthen cities and fortresses, and enclose them with walls and ditches. From that time on, they began to establish customs and laws and rights which were common to all the cities. That reason Cicero said, city was an assembly of men for living in one place and under one law. And to paraphrase it, what rationally, as a group that coordinates and discusses and produces what is good for all. So I'd like to invite you here just to think about who would like maybe one of you, or a few of you, to take away what do you think then for him here channeling Cicero and somebody who really knew one of the great cities of Europe at the time very intimately. So what do you think here for him? What is the definition of a city then? This would be ideal type, I suppose, in the industry. What are these centers?
I think it's the word that comes out of this text to me, and also it's connected to the text you sent, is the word law. And actually in Arabic, the
What
word
is it? Customs and law, which is slightly different law. People be thinking Roman law and but it's not use and customs and different tradition. Yeah.
in Arabic, the word for city is Medin,
Mhm.
where it's the din, where it's the law.
Nice.
So
Yeah,
it's
yeah, very
connected
nice,
to
yeah.
the place where the law is the
Made, conserved, enacted. Yeah. We saw the Qadi, the document that you shared. yesterday, presumably for his mission. Oh, right, presumably, if people wanted to have that judgment and that sale confirmed that we saw, that would be in an urban environment. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. So that connects. Thank you. That's really helpful there, actually. So we've got the law and the custom. We've got other things, though. But for another, I think, important element to it.
The people, think of the assembly of people.
Yeah.
That it is the human beings as opposed to.
Yeah.
What the article claims, the human people and what they do, their practices. Are the things that afterwards translated into this space called the city.
Yeah, space into place, and of course, their work and their labor and their ingenuity.
And I think that diversity as well.
Yeah.
I mean, they live under one law.
Yeah.
But under this law, there are so many other characters and habits and customs.
Yes, no, that diversity requires a law, doesn't it? The vid-
I guess it's just interesting that, you know, the Greeks make the same distinction between the polis as the people, right? And the place that the people are required to inhabit. And I guess goes the same thing for the law, the customs, the rights. It's like what a city needs, but I guess the definition is centered around the idea of a community.
Sorry?
The idea is centered around, at the heart of it, what a city is a community of people.
Yes,
They need laws, they need housing.
a
they need
diverse community,
streets.
you're absolutely right. But it's about the people and what they
Yeah.
can produce and what they can sustain, yes.
Just noticing that when reading through it, another big important part seems to be boundaries.
Yes.
And it starts
yes,
out with
yes.
that you have to first have this place.
Yes.
And then all the
Yeah.
stuff follows.
I really think the strengthening of the fortresses is important
Yeah.
because, I'll get to you in a minute, because exactly for that diversity to work, as humans, we are all afraid. I mean, that is to say, the sense of safety is essential. We'll get to that again. The sense of safety is essential, safety from outside, and as we will see, safety from within. And therefore, but this defining, this keeping yourself safe in every coin that represents a city, or always the walls, the walls, like we see from our breakfast table, the walls of Jerusalem. Sorry, we'll move on to shit.
Yeah. I would tell that what comes and pops up in mind is a unit. Because whatever the diversity inside with people, with shapes, with their communities, with religious, with all sorts of types of buildings, they all function under the same law as the one unit.
Yeah, so we get back again to the issue of the law and the centrality.
Yeah, but in a city you can find different laws. They all have to function together.
Yeah, there's a hierarchy,
Yeah.
isn't there, of
Yeah.
jurisdictions, you're absolutely right. And in some places, I mean, we're talking here about an ideal, I mean, in a lot of places that, we saw Marseille, in your city, for example, you've got the archbishop's bit, and you've got the count's bit, and
The
then you've
upper
got,
city, the lower city.
yeah,
The house of Bijou.
Yeah, yeah.
But also the.
complicated, yeah. But it's useful for us to know what, yes, David,
Just to add, like, the context of Tuscany in that time, I guess, is important because if you go in Tuscany, every little village is very clustered together and surrounded by a wall. Whereas you think there is space, there are hills that you could expand to, but they kind of tended to build it around that. And I guess the reality, the historical reality lends itself to this analysis and says, beyond the city walls are the landowners who rule by fiat. And within the cities, we have laws, and basically the idea that he says, you know, there are walls, and there's not only walls, but there's ditches, you know, like defensive military structures that are very common in Tuscany.
that's very helpful. And of course, to complicate it further, remember that Florence did not stay within its walls. Florence created a state that comprised great cities. Prato and Pisa ultimately takes over. So what happens to this idea of perfect city is closed within itself, doing its own stuff?
So interject though, because there's also this conflicting notion, or maybe it's a counterlinking kind of interdependency of the city and what's outside the wall.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important part of the
Yeah.
urban concept.
Absolutely, and of course, the great, I'll bring it up at the end. Ambrogio Lorenzetti, right? Early
That's
14th
exactly
century,
what it was in my
Siena,
mind.
Siena, famous frescoes. Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't bring it.
I haven't.
Could you
I'll
get it
put
up?
them together.
Okay, just call up the buon governo. And so
Oh,
the idea
really?
there is that the city has its walls, but they're not impermanent. They have these gates and the food comes in and people go out for leisure and everything's beautifully cultivated. And there's, of course, after everything that happens in the city is absolutely dependent upon the countryside, the raw materials for working people. And that is sort of not represented in this picture here, that what you said, which is, of course, the domination ultimately of the countryside outside, and the utter interdependence and dependence. I mean, you couldn't get cities until you could get a regular food supply, so every carpenter and shoemaker and whatever knew there would be bread in the morning to buy, and therefore he can concentrate on making fantastic shoes, which of course they still do. So a lot has come out of that. Thank you so much. And just to remind us that however attractive is analyzing the inner logic of vision, we are always bringing together. We also know other things that we know about it, and that image would be a really lovely
I think
accompaniment.
I'll have to email it to you though, because I don't think.
Don't worry, we'll find it right after. We'll bring it up on the screen. So just to give you two examples that are both working with the classical tradition, which is fundamental to thinking of everything and anything. But as you see, there's somewhat different emphases and languages and degrees of expansion. So moving on to diversity, which has already been raised by two of you. Thank you. Yeah, so reading those definitions, we could have thought the town, the kivas, or the kivis, or the town dweller, or these are all people with shared interests or similar interest. They're all committed to the city in a similar fashion. And of course, they're not, as Shido's already reminded us, in great degree of diversity. And necessity of that diversity for the very functioning of the city. Sitting side by side, intermingled business with each other, and you do business with each other, you also get into conflicts with each other, and even communities that keep really quite separate spheres in whole areas. I think about Jews or Muslims in an Iberian city, you know, they have their own systems of law regulating really important because of various lives of marriage, probate, various forms of community morality, etc. And this difference is sometimes, as I've already suggested, it's about religious difference, it's about ethnic difference, it's about places of origin. To us, perhaps today, the difference between Tuscan and Venetian might seem minute, but you know, as a citizen of a totally different polity, Venetian. And interestingly, there's some really interesting research that shows that a generation Tuscan merchant families or bankers will reside in Venice and not want them and particularly protect their Tuscanness in Venice, which is their edge, which is they offer networks that are different from the Venetian ones and not taking out citizenship, although that's perfectly possible. So, okay, we'll return to that. And the legal provision, as has just been said, has to be viable and seemingly reliable for all the groups involved. And with both protection and deterrence against you know, violence that might erupt against people, families, and groups. And there has to be a way in which also all these different groups have equal, not equal, but have sufficient access, it's not equal access to resources, like, for example, water supply. It's not equal access because in a city like Siena, which is renowned for its textiles, you know, the people in the textile industries have access to wool and more beneficial because they need it for their industry. So it's not as if it's like we all get the same share, but there's an attempt to rationalize access to resources. But basic access to resources has to be available to everyone who's within that region. And the diversity is expressed also in areas that are of voluntary institutional formation, Tuscans in Venice will have their own chapel, they'll have their own rites of for religious practice. We see Jews the same, and creating all sorts of markers that also associated with memory and family. And of course, there's the issue of that diversity is also expressed in more global networks, or global, I mean, the non-local networks, like I was thinking about these in Calcutta, today. But this issue of diasporas is absolutely crucial and arises from the very aspect of diversity and of the city, the diaspora, within the Italian, or within the British Isles, or of course, and it is increasingly over our period, the medieval, the modern, much more global in nature. We thought a bit about cities and diversity, which came quite naturally to a lot of you. And moving on then to this theme of the city as assemblage, and again, I want to stop here a little, because there's something about when one is first introduced to the concepts around factor network thinking, and that and the idea of assemblage is that one is just stating the totally obvious. I mean, is it obvious that there are people, there are things, there are ideas, there are institutions? Well, it may be obvious in our working, sort of living lives, but quite frankly, historians do not, on the whole, address, if you stop and think of your favorite book about a given city, on the whole, it remains very strongly at the level of the normative. It almost totally excludes into this type of history, very recently, aspects of the material and the environmental. And it's particularly, and this is true of history writing in general, it doesn't cope very well with the fact that lives are made of just a whole array of encounters that are random. I mean, statistically random, not random in terms of not important and not totally predictable by anyone. I mean, it's like you, Philip, sort of the person who happens to be on a particular ship and encounters a particular person that came from a place and had a pet, and the pet had been carrying the whatever the bacteria is. So how do we cope with the fact of the endless encounters and interactions between agents that we can never pin down like really from our sources? But we have to at least theorize it, for there to be some sort of space for occasionally being able to drill down in a sort of microstoria of sorts, and to capture some of the nature of those encounters. So I just listed here some of the elements we may want to always think. So I'm going to sort of, Moshe, because I so enjoyed your work and your presentation yesterday, I'm going to constantly return to you, just to say, even your document that you showed, we talked a bit about the materiality, a bit about the paper, but we thought about its afterlife, its endorsement by future users of that property or owners. But we also try to think, just now, where does the Cali sit? What is involved in terms of getting there? Who has access, etc. So just every one of our steps has to be, in a way, for a certain type of urban culture to emerge, or urban experience to emerge, to be a combination of those possibilities. So we might just stop here for a minute. I'm really interested to know what you thought. I really chose a very, very small and summative article just because you have so much to read for this school. But if people would like to maybe say what they took away from reading it, was it familiar? There are some of you in the room I know who are working at much more evolved levels of the implications of actor network theory. It'd be interesting to hear from some of you what you took away, what you thought was helpful, what you thought wasn't sufficiently helpful. And I know not everyone was able to read because there isn't a lot to read. You have.
Can I ask something?
Oh, yes, of course.
I was interested in the clustering of certain groups like the ghettos. And the ghettos are very early Jewish ghettos, like the one in Venice, for example. How does this, it's like a little city within a city, it's like a smaller city space functioning almost individually, but yet in correspondence with a larger space outside. So this is also like an interaction, but a very distinct one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think we can apply some of the considerations we already mentioned even in this session here to that. And I'll invite people, just remind people that the ghetto is a part of Venice that was allocated for Jewish use. It didn't mean the Jews were going to come and go, but they had to sleep there. They had to remain there. They had to own property there. A recent book about the ghetto by Dana Katz has shown that, in fact, views from the ghetto were the most sort of panoramic and attractive of the city, and because they have to build up because of the nature of the limited area under the basic area that sort of benefited in terms of air quality, whatever. But just an interesting aside. But you know what? So it's this idea of sort of zoning that makes a certain population live in a certain part of the town, and a desire by the town both to both to have them enclosed for reasons that are ideological and political, but on the other hand, not to lose any of the benefit of having this particular group's own distinctive contribution being made, of course, fiscally, but also in terms of professions and so on. So if we can think for a minute about that, and David, you wanted to say something.
That's a general comment about, you know, the network.
We'll return to the ghetto, don't worry. Yes, please say it.
That's about the networks and how I think is how it's not very helpful as, and I know it at some point in time it was very fashionable to think about actor network theory, but I think that if you take a look at what it helps us see and what it doesn't help us see, I think that good old structures that do much more work, analytically speaking, than actor network and the kind of idea of conceptualizing space or relationships as free-flowing and unstructured in a way, implicitly unstructured, let's say, in the actor network theory, kind of everyone, all the actors just play, and there is no, I don't know, terrain that they're looking out from. There is no, I mean, think about the contract that we were discussing in Cairo, right? There's so many structures that work there, present there, and to me, it makes less sense to speak about actor network theory than just, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to contextualize, I mean, you're right, it was developed in the 60s, and as some of you may remember that Latour really was looking for a way of thinking about scientific development.
Yes.
He went to the West Coast, which is rather nice for him coming out of Paris, because he resented quite a lot of the political trends at the time at work in Paris. And he just found this constant coming and going in the laboratory of all sorts of people who don't usually get into the story, like technicians and the people who serve lunch and the people who maintain the gardens that people walk in the breaks between their scientific work, and all sorts of stuff like that. Of course, also coming from a Paris that was deeply, deeply structured in exactly the way. So the idea was to somehow liberate the personal in a peculiar way, people without names but with function. Technician, the head of the laboratory, you know, and all the different people. So there was this element of multiplying the actors, which was actually in some ways liberating and progressive, bringing more actors into play, not just those who had an official name, but all the enablers. So that in terms of a social history, let's say, of science was, I think, very important and massive influence. But it's peculiarly depoliticized, you're absolutely right. And that's exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to imagine a world of ethics, not of politics. And that goes back to his whole formation and his commitments outside it's never outside the academic work. So for me, for historians, particularly looking at historians, it is that prompt to think more broadly about the enabling, and then of course it moves into the environment. That is to say, also what things do you have to have around you to even enable the beginning of activities like the paper? Who makes the paper? Who can afford to have paper? Where do you buy the paper, etc.? Just because we're constantly sort of concentrating on Moshe here and it's like contributing. So no, I totally hear what you're saying. It's absolutely fair what you're saying. I think in the study of the urban, it has had this contribution of trying to look at stuff that urban historians don't usually look at. And we do definitely, I agree with you, that we have to be aware that it has a certain politics of its own. And at the same time, it evacuates politics if you remain only with the terms of its own definition. So I think that's absolutely a fair criticism of it. With other people, how did it work for other people?
I'm interested in place, which is not a place, which is it's the margin of the city, the outskirts, the place beyond the wall.
Or indeed the set apart, like
The set apart, the marginal place of city, ancient city in the Middle East. And what I thinking a lot of time, not just now, I got encountered with text that talk about the marginal, about the communities that live in the margin of the modern cities. And what I was
Which
thinking,
of course Yara is interested in.
yeah,
And the very notion of the margin is of course itself already a way of viewing.
so how can I use thought, Western modern thought, Western modern analysis of cities inside an ancient Eastern city? Is it, what are there any applications of let's say immigrants that live in the margin of London to the leopards that live in the margins of Jerusalem beyond its walls?
Yeah, I think one has to say, and that's what I tried to say from the beginning, that we are absolutely committed to our place and our people, because that's what we do. But at the same time, I don't know how one can make sense of anything at all without having a perspective that's outside the local, if you see what I mean. But ultimately, it's not to be a slave to certain types of theories or concepts, because by definition, those who theorize, like Iris's once professor Reinhard Koselleck, he did not do, we talked over breakfast, his job was creating ideas about things. That was his job. That's what he did. He did not confuse himself with a multitude of archival research, that is fair to say. He was interested in concepts. And it's our job, because there is this sort of intellectual division of labor and emphasis. And it must be, and it has to be. So I see myself that the informed intellectual inhabits an area which they do to the best of their ability. But as much, they must equip themselves and participate in conversations that provide perspectives that are always political, as David would remind us. And often it's haphazard. It's who you meet and who you hear speaking to you and so on. There is no school for acquiring theoretical formation unless you were at a certain point in the Soviet Union or in Cold War America. I mean, it's always a combination of what institution you're at, is taught you, etc. But there can be a sort of, I think, a sort of committed and conscientious way in which one goes about testing the possibilities of comparison, of applying concepts. And I just want to say here something that is a big sort of a bee in my bonnet, which is there is a thing with medieval, well, particularly pre-modern people, the great fear of this terrible disease called presentism. Lest you might bring one of your concerns of this day to your work, as if you could not, right? And therefore the argument is, how can you apply to people in the past terms that they never knew? But remember, it's always in the early women's history and feminist history. So there are two answers to that. First of all, a lot of really like cutting edge thoughts about everything and anything, you will sort of find that in other words were discussed as issues in the philosophers of other cultures at other times and so on. So in that sense, that's one mode of self-defense, as it were, against this skepticism. But also, I think that, cautious and creative anachronism is a really useful intellectual tool, as to see where is the added value? Why this particular concept that may seem, as you say, fashionable? Where does it take you? If it takes you nowhere, if it just redescribes what you already know, but it gives a certain edge of perspective that helps you see what you might not see otherwise. I think to me, that's the test of it. And before we move on to Yara, just quickly to say that about the margins of cities, I think it's stupid. So I have currently a PhD student who's working on the borderlands between England and Scotland in the early 14th century, to a very, very violent period just before when there was a plague of raids, as it were, and it's a very violent area. Women left alone, women ravaged, nunnery ravaged. She's looking at how women experience the border. And her work was great. She went to the archive, she looked at all sorts of archival materials. And then I encouraged her to work about borders, what's being done, practically, comparatively, and so on. And probably some of her greatest insights have come from poetry, literature, and some social theory from the Mexican American.
Wow.
I mean, really, and she is a very, in her formation, very traditional historian, very, she doesn't do this stuff as a matter of course. But this has been a real eye-opener for her, just as an example of, yeah, but let's talk more about that. That's such an important, and also the margins are within. As we know, we walk around cities. It's not like everything is fine and dandy and then there's all the stuff on it. And also cities grow, and all of a sudden what was outside the walls and rather becomes gentrified because the city's growing, and all of a sudden there's another set of walls further out. And in the betwixt of the two walls, you have perfectly good neighborhoods and so on. So then the question is, what happens to those lepers and those prostitutes and so on? And those are phenomena that we really know well from our own places as well. So, yeah, so the margin within, I mean, every household has its margins. Where do the servants live? Where do they eat? How are they treated? Yeah, and we all have the ghetto in mind, and then we must progress. So yeah, do you want to say just something? Yes, raise your voice if you can, or stand up maybe.
We always speak about Western and Eastern, you're right. Generally, I believe in this room, we're very much West Northern perspective towards cities. In Europe, we make northern cities, United States, Israel, whatever.
China, India.
China, India is a different story.
The pilgrims that came to Jerusalem from the West had Western perspective.
Yeah.
Even if it.
I know really
Yeah.
zoom out theory over here. Now, when you look at Eastern perspective, then we hear about how cities have been created, and that goes into your point. Because we have, very generally speaking, two types. One that was made by top down, the Caesar, the Tadi, the whatever,
Yeah.
whatever. And we, okay, we are going to create here a city because I have my own interests, usually military, whatever, and then we make the Cardo, the Romanos, the whatever system, the Indian system is different. Whatever system that you have, and it comes from top down, and then the little details are going inside, and then complex systems get into action, because the little details, they have to negotiate for the details, and that's many details. Eastern perspective, going totally different, goes with Islamic systems. Even though the researcher writes about Islamic systems, there's complex layers. And then we don't do from top down, we don't first organize and then the details are organized into the sense. Rather, it makes small communities that creates bigger communities, and the law is created from bottom up. That you details agents that are creating similarities or agreements, let's say, and then few of them that makes it really, it's like a very accumulating system. At the end of the day, it goes with Islamic law, it goes whatever, and the authority will get that because they see that the process is happening. It's two different mechanisms of how cities are created originally. Yeah, what period are you talking about? Or what?
But Baghdad.
I disagree.
Yeah, I
You're
totally-
thinking of pre-modern
So,
times?
so
No, cities were created by
Capitals.
rulers.
that,
Ramle, Baghdad,
yeah, lovely.
El Kahira, well-planned cities.
Well, no, not
Of
always,
course
not always.
They
Can I
in the
just,
West the same.
yeah, can I,
Villages turned into. Of course, in modern time, it's the opposite. In modern time, most cities are actually created by agents, because most cities are what I was mentioning yesterday, unauthorized, unregularized, et cetera. And we do have the center of Luanda, okay, which is very much regularized, top-down plan, da, 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 da. But 300,000 people, 7 million other people are living unrecognized, and what they're actually creating is a complex system, which is exactly made by agents, individuals that are creating some sort of mechanisms and plans.
so this is where history comes in, that, I think that it's very strange, but you're voicing something that I think Max Weber tried to create, which is of course a distinction between the Asiatic and the Occidental. We know where that comes from, and it was extremely schematic, it skewed the scholarship, and all the scholarship that's coming now. I mean, quite a few people are working with European and Near Eastern, I mean, West Asian, I'm not sure what to call it, but basically Islamic cities that are closer to Europe, and the direction from the top is very dramatic. But I think what you do bring into mind is the fact that the cities are not described in those texts, but they are these types of interactions. The thing about Europe, and I would say Europe, the Mediterranean, which of course comprises Islamic Cape lands as well, ultimately, is that they have the Roman infrastructure. The Roman infrastructure cannot be ignored. If you've got the roads, you've got the aqueducts, you've got the hippodromes, you've got everything there, that is already shaped the way. And that also means that there's a certain persistence also of official. So that part of Europe, and of course it goes fairly north in Europe, it's well into Germany and France, this infrastructure. Therefore, so even when maybe communities of merchants or whatever start coalescing, they're already benefiting from the top-down heritage of a previous age. And that's where the palimpsest is quite a useful sort of image. So I think it's really useful to bring this idea of the complex coming together of different desires, of different types of citizenry. I don't think that I recognize altogether such a stark distinction between the East and the West. But you'll continue the conversation on it. Okay.
There's an article by Nimrod Luz about the Mamluk Jerusalem. I think just response to it.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, maybe you can circulate that to the group.
No.
On the WhatsApp. No, we have the WhatsApp group, so you can do that. Okay, phew, that was interesting. We will have reason to return to You Are Not. So we have to move on because we've gotten to different places. So absolutely just suggesting to you, and you're right that this is old stuff, but it was sort of revived recently by historical geographers who found a certain edge and usefulness, particularly those interested in environment and resources, in looking at some of the, and particularly the later stuff that came out of the post Latourian stuff that's being developed on the basis of it. So we're going to move into this theme then of sort of place being made into space being made into place. And this is just one way of thinking about how an endowment of resources becomes something that people connect with, use, produce, regulate, talked about the law, and so on. And that, of course, this process is utterly one of producing knowledge about yourself, family, or community, what is safe, what is not safe, where you can walk in the town, where you feel less comfortable walking in the town, which might include something like segregated residence areas like the ghetto. And this process is, well, first of all, it's process. It's never ending, because every new person who passes through that gate contributes to the whole of the making of it within the frameworks of law. So this idea that the city, the people make the city, but the city makes the people. I always like this quote to share. It's a 13th century book that's about how to be that super perfect Jew, not just basic rules, but a more ethical reflection about to be even better. So here is a sort of sage warning from someone who lived in a flourishing city, Regensburg, and he writes and says, you know, Jews are always looking for places to live, safe, or where there are business opportunities, etc. But when they consider where to go to, when Jews look around for a place in which to live, they should take stock of the residents of the town. How chaste are the Christians there? Know that if Jews live in that town, their children and grandchildren will also behave just as Christians do. For in every town, Jews are just like Christians. There's bakshish in the city. We'll have to do it. We'll become part of that. If it's a place where women are harassed in the streets, your kids will start doing that as well. All those ethical aspects of sort of the culture of a place, what it is to be a local. Nobody can resist them, become part of them, become enmeshed in them. And therefore, Jews should worry about going to places that are less chaste than they would want to be. And that's from somebody who knew full well that, or understood that the idea is that if a person does, obeys all 613 pious actions that a Jew must adhere to, surely it makes them the perfect person who can withstand anything. Clearly not. The city is stronger even than that. This.
Just a question about, because you were talking about knowledge just before. I don't see knowledge here really. Like the way that the Christians behave, how chaste they are, if they catcall women, if they, I don't know, if they're promiscuous in youth or whatever. Is that knowledge, or I'd say it's
Well, the
it's
knowledge.
behavior,
It's not printed, but it's knowledge.
culture maybe.
Knowledge about the
But knowledge
population,
about-
it's like
Just knowledge.
spying in order to know
But
how.
this is the city makes its people, the claim was also that knowledge is this kind of constituted force that makes a city, right?
Yes,
It's not necessarily.
It's anthropological knowledge.
yeah,
It's like an anthropologic,
yes, but
insights.
it's something that becomes internalized, as it were, as norms of behavior. Isn't it? What we want to say, Tom?
Just a word, and there are always many of these, and they don't agree. Ask the residents of an American city about their ethnography of the police, and you'll find very sharp differences founded on facts. Very different. So this is always something part of urban life. Too many things.
Like that's come from when Moses in the Bible he sent 12 spies in order to
Assess.
check about
Yeah.
the country, about Canaan, how are the residents, how is the state, is it worthwhile to go there? So I think it's connected to this kind of thinking. You should check before you go somewhere.
I mean, it's very different, say, from the vision that, say, Puritans in the 17th century going to us, creating the colonies there. The idea was they're going to a place and they're going to create a city on a hill that will be different from everything around them where it became full. Here, the idea is you may be a really well-meaning Jew, but you are going to become what your community will encourage you to become. You will adapt and you will become that. In that sense, knowledge,
Actually, the
local
Puritans
knowledge.
didn't think they were going to be pure. They thought they were going to be inspected and their faults would be clear to the world. So when they say we're going to be a city on a hill, they mean everyone will be watching us.
Oh, sorry. Did anybody want to say anything more about this?
No, I wanted to
Yeah.
talk about the ghetto and the Venetian ghetto and the issue of knowledge. And yeah, knowledge doesn't have to be printed yeah, for sure. But when it's printed, it's more solid and it can. And I think most of you know the story of the etymology of the ghetto neighborhood. It's a strange. I used to work on the Venetian ghetto 25 years ago. It's a strange etymology because there there was a fabric where the people combine and fuse and mix the metals together. So
A factory, I think.
yeah, factory. So gettare, it's meaning mixing,
Throw
fusing,
together.
which is, and in like 50 years, the Jewish etymology imposed himself, the get, the get of the divorce, separation, breaking of the alliance makes sense, much more than the perfect, but so it's false, but it's more efficient. And we can see that when the Roman ghetto was created, so it's in the 80s, I think.
Yeah.
So 70 years after, it's called ghetto. So it's done.
It's become a coin, yeah.
And even in Venice, there was the first neighborhood in 1516. It was the new fabric. So the place was called Ghetto Nuovo because it's a new fabric. And after that, they created an extension because and here there was the old fabric, Ghetto Vecchio, but it doesn't make sense in the Jewish history of the places. And in the map, that the toponym get inversed because the people they forgot the real etymology, and finally the popular Jewish fabrication of etymology which get printed. And now in the beginning of the 20th century, the historian worked again and rediscovered the real etymology. And now when you are in the ghetto, you go through the Ghetto Vecchio, which is the new one, and you get in the big Ghetto Nuovo, which is the old one. So it's always a kind of dialogue between popular knowledge and historian knowledge, and then it's get in and out. Yeah.
Move on just a little bit. So, so how is this diversity created? How is this assembled perhaps? It's by people being let in. And that again is process. It's so interesting. Really, it's process. It's entering and becoming part of a city, albeit it was never the case for everyone living in a criminal city was actually exercising full citizen rights, of course not. But the proximity to the city, the coming maybe to sell something, to buy something, you get to know the city, you get to do business with people. There's somebody who can act as your guarantor. This is what I tried to map as that chapter. And then you have people who can stand for you and say, yes, let's give this person the probationary benefit of maybe joining the city. And during that period, you have to show that you're worthwhile in terms of some endowment that you bring to the city, be it just working hands, or be it a profession, or be it a craft, something that you can do. And in some places, and then of course, once you start the process of joining, you really have to commit. And the way cities tested that commitment is by bringing your family and by building a home. And in some places, they'll literally give you the materials to build a home. There's some examples there. It's so interesting, Stephanie. I'm thinking about the history of migration, which you've studied, all the different types of prompts and allurements to get people to come. And the issue of family, of course, is absolutely crucial. And entering into local networks. In Venice, for example, the guilds, there was sort of was subcontracted to the guild. If a guild approves of you, that's the pathway to citizenship. And the payment at entry is shared between the guild and the city. And there are different cities regulate. So again, we see, grosso modo, we see there's a certain type of process characterized similarly in different cities and different regions, but then every city figures out what makes sense. So that's Yara going back to the issue of the local negotiation of detail, sort of, is the probation period 20 years, 10 years, 5 years, all arising from local conditions of how desperately do you need new people? How suspicious are you because you were burnt in the past by unsuccessful policies around migrations, etc. And then, of course, the phenomenon of chain migration, which is very familiar to us and operates there as well. And we can take making place, this idea of space into place, into other places, and thinking your ship becomes a sort of republic of sorts, with all its inequalities, with all its commonalities, with of course the ethos, which is the religious practice that binds people, and also determines their itineraries, because they'll stop off to go to a good shrine or something on the way to where they're meant to go. I thought that was quite a good example of space into place. For the duration, obviously the temporality is important here as well. And I thought Tissot, in a way, I thought he came to London, he was building a life, how do you build a life? And maybe poring over maps, maybe he became interested in this whole idea of travel and displacement and so on, from the images with which you opened our, all the presentations, so that's sort of, now, this being plural, this being diverse in the city, can, it's acquiring all this type of thing that I call knowledge, which is how you do stuff locally. But it can also be like, you know, micro decisions about stuff that looks really, really minute. It's quite interesting. This arises again, Sefer Hasidim, but it's backed up by urban documents about disputes over windows, which we find between Jews and Christians. Some wonderful work being done in Elisheva Baumgarten's group up on Mount Scopus. So Sefer Hasidim explains the guideline. So the idea is that a Jew should not be in the city in a position where they might seem to be bowing to Christian statues, whatever. So the recommendation is this, that when a man comes to make windows for his house, he should avoid abominations that occur when he opens the window, bowing, opening his window, you know, fastening it, you know, and seems to be bowing and often turning towards the idolatry, church, a chapel, a statue, as is to say, blah, blah. And a synagogue should not have a window facing the idolatry. And one should not put books on the windowsill. So you go and you collect your books off a windowsill and you may do a gesture that might be interpreted as being one of bowing or offering obeisance, lest this be idolatry. So again, this is like the refinement of the principle. This is something really recommends to those who are super aware and super pious how to comport themselves even at levels of such sort of micromanagement. And think of those late medieval and early modern cities that became covered with paintings, decorations, you know, as Ed Muir called it, a Madonna at every street corner. It's sort of hard to avoid you move around your house. And so just to suggest the less obvious areas of this life, which is embedded and local and you belong, but you belong on terms that are terms of a certain element of difference. And this is true not only for religious minorities. We have these really long-standing groups from other parts, from other places, that settle for long periods of time and for generations in other places. So we think of, say, in a city like London, you've got your Tuscans and your Lombards and your members of the Hanseatic League, that's sort of the cities trading around the North Sea. So here in this this image here, which is by the famous printmaker Wenceslaus Haller, you see the steel yard over there. It's on the Thames. It's a whole neighborhood where the Hanseatic, these sort of Northern European merchants and financiers, mostly merchants, settled. There were regulars, there were familiars, their families were there for generations. The Italians tended not to come so much in with families. They tended to be more groups of men, of relatives, often uncles, nephews, fathers, sons. And they were as much Londoners as they were anything else. In fact, a lot of them spent more of their time in London in terms of years than they did elsewhere. They had their own chapels. They had marriage relations with each other. They negotiated as a group with the authorities, in this case, the top-down authority of the crown. And they were citizens, as I said earlier, they didn't seek to become citizens. Unlike, at the same time, there are communities, like say Islamians or Jews, there are communities that these groups are familiar strangers. Find the right word to describe it. And that was totally a vestige of urban life in European cities. And this, so as I say, they built their own, they built their own chapels, they invested, building a chapel is not nothing, right? And so did the Jews in a city like Cologne. So this is my friend Netta Bodner, who kindly gave me the image. That is her at the bottom, dipping in. A mikveh is a ritual bath. It's bath not for washing, it's for purification. It's done on men and women very regularly, men less regularly, unless they're very, very committed. And so this goes down 4 stories underground in Cologne. We know the masons who built it because they've left masonry marks, and we know that they were not local masons who were in town for some other very, very big Christian building project. So again, the Cologne Jews enjoyed the style, Gothic style. There was these light recesses. You'll see in a minute there's a big Georgia kind. Let me share. That is a massive into the future. Vast, vast extent. Stunningly beautiful. And in the middle of the Jewish quarter, in the middle of a Christian city. So the level of embeddedness, it's so many different levels, let alone subterranean embeddedness there, I think just gives us a sense of what was being managed here, which is a total sort of settlement and settlement indifference, and that all this was enabled because the law at least gave sense most of the time of a certain predictability, sense of safety, and oops, let's bring that for a moment there. So I thought it was a really good example of this making a space into place and investing a great deal in it. So we have not much time together remaining, but I thought also talk about another way of how space becomes, or place becomes, a very special type of place. When even within a city, and this is a rather crude map of the different neighborhoods of Siena, you'll remember, up on hills, and divided into these official neighborhoods. But even the Sienese themselves, it's an enormous city. This is about 60,000 at its highest in the pre-modern period. And in our discussion previously about Tuscany, that raised Siena ultimately itself becomes enveloped in the big, embrace of the Florentine polity. But in the period, 13th, 14th century, and before the plague, when it's really at its most flourishing Republican sort of, success, in those neighborhoods, they were not just official demarcations for the purpose of local city management. We became and still are extraordinary places for identification, for competitive identification as opposed to other parts of the city. And these are all captured in the summertime, July and August, horse races. You would have heard of Rossini in the Palio, where from the morrow, it was really quite striking to see, from literally the morrow after the Palio, they start preparing for the next conflict. Be it the embroidery of the costumes, be it the training of the boys who throw the banners, be it practicing the chant and so on. So the making of place, it's not just something that those who have arrived have to acclimatize and therefore build their mikvahs and do their stuff. Even within the city, in its diversity, there is a certain pleasure in, utility in, and investment in that internal demarcation of the city, which may well, Yara, of course, include groups that are, and it's very interesting because Siena has grown since then a bit, not much, a bit. And I've often asked people, so if you're like living in this area, you're part of Siena, but you're not in the historic, there is an allocation to the old contrade, each one of those, of as were the radiation out of each contrada to its extension in the here and the now into new habitations. And it's the competition is extraordinary, the investment is extraordinary because they all train up their horses and to keep the horses on a jockey. And so another way of thinking of it, because so far I've slightly more emphasized the issue of diversity of religions and religions, etc. Within this, the advantages of that sort of local, even micro identification within your contrada. And of course, it has to do also with issues of patronage. The Sienese claim that they don't have much sort of trouble with youth sort of disaffection as Florence does in a very big way, because they reckon their kids are constantly involved in, practicing and drumming and being aggressive against their neighbors in some sort of channeled way. Yes.
It's just another example in Florence itself. There's now it's mostly a touristic attraction. They do have this pre-modern football.
Yeah.
Or they kind of play drunk in these costumes.
Calcio storico.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
but then they kind of it's based on these neighborhoods identifications, these quarters of this town, which also extends to the new parts of town.
Yeah. It's extremely distinctive. I remember one of my colleagues saying, we have no problems with drugs because we have the value.
And drugging the horse.
Except for drugging. Really quite astonishing of the actual.
This radiation reminds also of Jerusalem after the 48th war, when the Jews of the old city of Jerusalem have to flee to the new Jerusalem, and they build synagogues that are reflecting the synagogue that was in the old city.
Diasporic behavior.
Exactly.
Diasporic behavior. Yes.
So about Siena, so this competition, according to the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are it's the fiscal or political division of the city, or
Yeah.
it's something
In any case, so in the organization of all sorts, like clearing and rubbish collection, everything.
Okay.
These are very long-standing divisions, what we call in London, it's wards, and every place like contrada here, okay? I mean, that's like the sort of municipal center, which is the picture I started with, when you see the campo over there. And quite frankly, and there are certain groups, like the Jews tended to concentrate in those very, very central ones, the Torre especially. But there are other groups that are dotted around. And it really is, the sort of the competitive aspect has to be emphasized because it is actually very aggressive.
Yeah.
It's aggressive in terms of strategy, plan, secrecy, mobilization of everybody. And then, of course, all of it, how do you keep them? So if they're so diverse, if they're so disparate and sort of competitive, how do they work together? Like, I don't know, in schools and town councils. Well, they also have a solution to that, which is my next, I think, development slide. Because it's all done under this tutelage of the Virgin Mary. Because the palio itself is a competition in honor of the Virgin. The palio, the actual prize banner that is given to the winner, is always of an image of the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is supposed to be the patron of the city. So that's the sort of glue that keeps all the disparate parts together. So it's sort of quite carefully sort of modulated in that way. But these, I just want to emphasize that these are year-long activities. It's not just something a few weeks before you get yourself organized. The structures, and actually when a friend of mine married a guy in Siena, and she's from Pisa, and she had to be baptized it's called to be baptized into the contrada with all the sense of rebirth and assuming a new identity. She had to shed her Pisanness in favor of Sienese. And it was important that this happened because she wanted to have the family, and it was important when this should happen. So just, I mean, this is one particularly well-documented example, and my family has been going on the summer holidays there for almost 25 years, so I know a lot about it, but I mean, I think one can extract or relate it to some of the more sort of, some of the concepts we worked with here and some of the ideas we had here about how diversity is contained within and channeled and managed in these communities, and each bigger community will have its own themes of how to do it. I mean, a city like Paris is really rather different because it's a big world capital in the early modern, and there it's much more about issues of sort of display that are actually mounted. That would need to go back to the issue of talking, but I thought this was a quite telling one. And yeah, and this unifying figure, and this is a particular image that was then replaced by a whole series of images in the 14th and 15th century as taste developed by the great Sienese artist Duccio. And you see there all the different flowers of the different contrade hanging there, and that all together comprises Siena.
Because I'm asking because in other cities, of course, you have like multiple, right, divisions of the city working together. So we're in fiscal, from fiscal point of view, I'm in neighborhood X, and from and the name of the neighborhood is something else, and with the identification of Jewish or Christian or Kurd or something else, it's like a third layer of dividing the city, and this is like maybe another way of dealing with diversity.
So I should say that within these contrade, it's not as if it erases all difference, because what's very striking is that it's only men who participate who represent the contrade. Even today, the women do the big meal after they do all the embroidery. They obviously avail their kids and support them in their drumming and whatnot and singing. They walk and march in the streets, singing passionately, a group of women right behind the group. So this is not something that becomes, I mean, it's a place where other types of hierarchy are enacted. And I remember that this friend of mine, who's a professor of medieval law, he also told me that the fact that his son, when he was 18 or 19, was the guy who carried the banner of their contrada, has been for him a pathway to really very successful employment thereafter. He's a very talented guy, but he became sort of the head of football in Siena. I mean, a massive job. I mean, so, and then all that was a pathway towards civic participation. So all these areas of sort of patronage and advantage are really important. So we should never lose the sense of the city and its diversity is about competition, and it's about placement, and it's about great disparities of wealth. And all of that is managed locally, again, through the endowments that are available. And sometimes, of course, they totally collapse. And with that, we will finish, because that embedded diversity also produces certain vulnerability. So the fact that you can get together and build over several years a beautiful mikveh at great expense and feel that this is something that will be used for generations does not mean that at the same time is not attached to you also the vulnerability that was attached to Jews wherever they lived, and in certain periods, the period of the Black Death, like others, there can be obviously a breakdown of all these arrangements into the most extraordinary type of violence, but that happens at certain points, and however destructive and traumatizing it is, it resides alongside long periods when this diversity is managed in the ways that we tried to delineate here. And what has been also striking, I think, even until the last discussion of Siena, is that ritual action is one way, very sort of, traditionally Durkheimian way of people come together and they effervesce and they become imprinted with what they have to share, and all is good for a while. But of course, sort of subsequently, anthropologists think now of ritual also as zones of danger, because rituals try to make schematic in order to always, what about all the people who are not processing? What about all the people who are excluded from processing? Women, poor people, foreigners, Jews, Muslims, whatever. So ritual action, not so much as a group, sometimes as a group, but sometimes also as a sort of almost like a ferment of resentment and even violence. And that there's a great deal of shared knowledge that transcends that difference. And sharing knowledge doesn't mean that you agree, doesn't mean you think it's fair, doesn't think you wish it were different, but it means a certain understanding of the rules of play. And sometimes working with them, petitions through creating advantageous alliances and so on. And what I think really strikes me is the shared aesthetic, habits of comportment, ideas about gender. I mean, across all these communities, everyone is equally of a patriarchal disposition, that goes for sort of without saying. But and the shared aesthetic, people started dressing like locals and being comfortable in local modes of comportment. And in our practices, I think, therefore, I encourage you, and this is really what all this was about, to think about, we heard a lot about ideas. And I mean, in a way, hearing you speak yesterday about what makes for the real best level of description of human communities, the choreography of that can be all contained, all seen, all understood, etc. So in a way, to look beyond that into all the breaking up the perceived whole of the choreographic, and to make that description really a cutting one. And of course, which we haven't had time to deal with, only to gesture towards, is the issue of the different temporalities that operate in any community at the same time. People living by different calendars, by different sounds, the sound of church, the sound of work, the sound of home, and all of that again having to coincide. And I have an ex-PhD student working on the spread of public expressions of time, that is clocks and bells and whatnot in the late medieval, early modern, and as a form, as a technology of governance. So so much more to discuss, but I'm going to stop here. Thank you for listening.